各位观众朋友们，大家好，欢迎收看 JxJ 论坛，由我 Jimmy J 马健和我们的好朋友 Jim Noteware 为我们去讨论这个礼拜的时事。Jim,
Hi, Jimmy. Good afternoon.
good afternoon and welcome home.
Thank you.
California must be it's nice to be there during this time.
Yes. Last week, this time, we had a very good time with the life celebration for my father. It was great for me to reconnect with my brothers and other family and friends. It turned out very, very nicely. We're very pleased.
Yes.
And my father would have been pleased.
I love that life celebration. He lived a full, fulfilling life, raised a family for all his offsprings to come back and celebrate. Celebration. That's what it is. And, at our age, it's either weddings or, to have. Speaking of which, Northern California. First of all, California has a very high concentration of Asian American residents and voters. In some precincts, they're the majority, which is very rare anywhere else. And what happened in San Francisco was very telling. So the Chesa Bodine, did I say it right? Chesa
Bodine, I think he pronounces his name. Yeah.
Was recalled. It's very telling because I saw some statistics on voter turnout and how they voted. The people that gave him the most support are overwhelmingly high-income Caucasian precincts. And the ones that overwhelmingly opposed them were actually minority and a lot of Asian areas that supposedly his policy is supposed to help. Instead, it's the other way around. Isn't that very surprising, Jim?
Well, actually, no. I don't think so. I don't think it's surprising. Let me explain how I can reconcile what may be a paradox. The first one is the people who you say supported him, wealthy white Caucasians, that makes sense because most of those people are aloof from the realities that go on in the streets. And they can follow their liberal fantasies. Limousine liberals is what we call them. All they want. Pardon me?
What was it? What kind of liberals?
Limousine liberals.
I've heard that before. I'm sorry.
People who have so much money and so many blessings in life that they frankly don't care about the rest of the things. They can believe whatever they want because they can live in a fantasy world. But the idea that letting criminals go is attractive to minority communities, whether they're Asian, Hispanic, African Americans, etc., really is an arrogant self-projection on the minority communities where people live and endure crime. It makes no sense because, for instance, African-American crime, the largest victims are African-Americans. Black on black crime, we hear that all the time. Asian Americans are the subject of routine crimes and also hate crimes, which we've talked about many times on this show. Hispanic Americans suffer from it as well. I don't know why the arrogant limousine liberals think that since most criminals are various minority groups, why the other people in the minority groups are interested in being soft on crime. The logic just doesn't follow. And it's been well known that in minority neighborhoods, the biggest issues are crime. Most African-American populations in big cities are crying out for more police support. Yes, are there examples of police overreaction and abuse of authority? Yeah, they are, but that's relatively small compared to the crime that people suffer in the minority communities. I think all up and down the scale, dealing with crime is not a partisan issue. It's not a liberal versus Democratic issue. If there are bad guys that are doing things, we all have an interest in those bad guys being locked up and keep them there. And if there are examples of mental illness, etc., that people who are mentally ill cross the line into committing criminal acts, they need to be locked up as well, perhaps in a different type of facility with different kinds of care. But we cannot ignore it. We can't just let it keep happening. And pretty soon this discussion rolls around to homelessness and people who are suffering both mental illness and substance abuse and things. I don't think it is kind to them to leave them alone either. They need help. We need to be responsible and restore the kind of help we need to figure out when it comes to mental illness. We need to figure out how to get people back into the proper kinds of institutions. There are mental illness institutions today, and they're called jails. No, that's correct.
I don't mean to cut you off, Jim. I always said that you're very sensible and you don't pander to an extreme group. So I already know what you're saying is gonna have people are gonna question it. So I'll ask a question myself right now. What you just said. First of all, mental illness is for me. I don't even want to bring it up because that echoes what Cruz and Abbott is saying. Every country has mental illness, not just us, but no country has mass shootings like us. We established that. I know your stance on it. You believe in controlling it and background checks. You're not bought off by the NRA. So mental illness to me is an insult to bring this up after Uvalde. It's an insult to bring up mental illness when we know the data doesn't lie. Countries that have strict gun laws doesn't have this kind of issues. Second, no Democrat, no party, no elected official will come out and say, yes, vote for me because I'm soft on crime. Everything else you said, I completely agree with because I'm very happy that these extremists are voted out of office because their policies do not help the neighborhoods. But I can tell you where people are going to attack this thing. Number one, soft on crime. These extremists believe that we need to keep people out of jail, that this system systematically for decades has been a different number of incarceration rate for certain races. Second, police brutality, you're right, it's a small group. But because of the BLM movement, because of the protests a few years ago, it swept a whole group of people into office, and now they're out. And now they're out of the office. So for these politicians, elected officials to pander to a certain group, just like the folks here, that makes Texas look really bad, like we mentioned, Uvalde, and it looks bad because they are pandering to NRA group. Well, in the left coast, in the West Coast, it's different. They're pandering to certain groups to guarantee that it will win, but it showed that it doesn't work that way. You have to govern and set law and order for the majority of the people. You have to service your community, protect it, and have the constituents' best interests at heart instead of that's a small group that gives you the most contribution. So if you say soft on crime, to them, they're gonna say, hey, we're trying to reverse this high incarceration rate, high prosecution rate. We're trying to not have this generation of one-parent homes. We're trying to stem this unfair judicial system. We're trying to stop. Do you get what I'm saying? Because you can argue both sides. Look, both things can be true, by the way. This is not specific. Republicans, conservatives could also say, hey, we do want to have a fairness in our justice system while we can have law and order. For the Democrats, why does it have to be one or the other? Why can't we also not have law and order and also have a fair system?
Well, Jimmy, I think we should.
Yes,
the criminal justice system isn't limited to policemen arresting people and putting them in jail. Part of the problem is justice delayed is justice denied. Our court systems are woefully backed up many, many years in Harris County because of the flood damage to our courthouses and because of the pandemic. Part of the reason that these criminals that were arrested on multiple cases kept getting turned out is the court system could not hear their cases, could not bring them to trial. If they were tried on one of the early cases, they could have been sentenced and put away on a permanent basis.
That's
But
very fair.
the whole thing from top to bottom is broken. It's terribly broken.
It cannot be just blamed on the Democrats or the Republicans.
No, I'm not trying to make
I'm
this.
not saying you. I'm saying the media, the way they try to manipulate. It's not you.
No,
Because you're telling us the truth. You're being accountable. You're telling people what's accountable, which is from flood to the system. You're not pitting on one side, which is if most elected officials do this, then they'll fix the problem instead of using it as a political advantage.
Yeah, for political advantage. Remember what the business of journalism is. It's to sell papers. It's to sell advertising on TV shows or radio shows. And the way they do that is to get people agitated. When I used to write for the Houston Business Journal, John Beto, the publisher at that time, he's now retired, but at that time we used to talk about how do you get public engagement? You get public engagement by public enragement. And I think the people in big media understand that very well. And it's not just the substance, it's the tone at which they do, it's what they choose to cover and not cover, etc. And I think it's intentionally misleading. And that's why I think an informed citizen has to seek information from many, many, many different sources and has to devote a big portion of their time just to keep up with the evolution of the events that are unfolding and look at things big picture as well as what matters to them today and in their short radius.
I don't disagree with any of that. You're absolutely right. Media, journalists, we're supposed to have journalistic integrity. So I'm very proud to say that for our show here, we do not take donations, we do not take advertising. We get to say whatever we feel like. It is dangerous, right? Because we do not take sides and we criticize both. And we're probably gonna not be able to educate or pander to viewers. That's the same way you run your elections too. But that's what America used to be.
Yeah. But I think what happened in San Francisco earlier this week, it's an example, and it's being talked about everywhere, and it had been talked about well in advance of that. I think it basically says that the broad base of Americans are very concerned about crime from the bottom up, and it's time we made some significant changes. And what was going on in San Francisco is simply intolerable. And I think you're going to see the same thing in Los Angeles, and we'll see other variations of it in other places like New York City. Violent crime has surged in New York City over the last couple of years, and people there are not tolerating it. And there's a silent reaction to that very few people talk about, which is many, many people are leaving these big cities, starting with New York and LA, because they no longer want to tolerate it. They're not just voting in the ballot box, they're voting with their feet and their family and their fortunes and everything else. Why is Texas growing? Why is Florida growing? Other Sunbelt states like Arizona as well.
Red states with blue cities. That's the way to go.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the way it's, because in Texas, people can choose to live where they want. When I was housing director for the city of Houston, I used to joke about the paradoxes with our mayor then, Anise Parker. And she would say, Jim, what are the paradoxes you're talking about? And I would say, well, Houston takes great pride in being one of the most ethnically diverse cities, correct? Yes, everybody understands that. Everybody's very proud of that. So what's the paradox? The paradox is our friends at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development are criticizing and have criticized Houston for a very long time by saying it's one of the most segregated cities there is. In other words, people live in ethnically segregated neighborhoods. It's not because they have to. It's not because they're forced to. It's because they choose to. And guess what? They get along very well. They trade with each other. They intermingle, but they can live where they want. They can worship where they want, with whom they want, and everyone has total freedom. They just choose to self-select where they live. And is one of the biggest paradoxes.
I always like to say that this whole conversation, instead of using race as the common denominator, it's really about income, about your educational level, about your career, about your family choices. There's so many factors into it. Nobody chooses to have crime. Nobody will exchange their family or children's safety in return for lower incarceration rate. Like you said, our prison system is not for profit. We have a problem. We have a problem with letting people out of jail because of the flood, because of the broken system, bureaucracy. All that needs to be fixed, no matter who's you belong to. The sad thing is, they both want the party. They both want the issues to continue. That way, there's something to use for the next election. We have become a government of elections. It's about the cycle every 4 years, every 2 years.
And one of the things that I think is happening, and I think the San Francisco election is an example of it. I think in many respects, the pendulum has swung so far in that direction that it's time for it to come back. Most political decisions always overshoot. Then they have to come back to the center, back and forth and back and forth. You can see it in almost any definition of political life. It's one of the reasons why Democrats and Republicans oscillate in the Oval Office, who gets elected president, et cetera. But I think more and more people are waking up and exerting their political influence directly in the voting booth, directly in census counts and people moving around, and in other community and political organizations. And I think what they're finding is most government is failing in its delivery of services and incompetence, and people simply aren't going to tolerate it anymore. One of the things I found when I was in California again last week is how many Californians have moved not just to Texas or Arizona, but to Idaho and Montana, and they're very, very happy there. The neighborhoods in Boise, Idaho, and Bozeman, Montana, are very much like the neighborhoods I grew up in the 50s in California. And they have some of the more old traditional values, and Republicans and Democrats alike move there. And guess what? They get along well.
It's very expensive. Yeah, it's not to say it's very expensive now. I look into Idaho, Bozeman, there are a lot of tech billionaires, New York City, hedge fund people that move out there for their kids to have a better life for themselves, to live longer, right? To trade off. And everything's there. I mean, with the internet, with Amazon, you can get anything. Technology is amazing. It's a curse and a boom. But Jim, back to this. When you talk about limousine liberals, to be honest, whether you're liberals or Republicans or conservatives, the fact is, because income level of education, whatever it is, we do live in a ivory tower where we don't experience the crime ourselves, where we don't really, the inflation hurts us, but we're lucky that we're not living paycheck to paycheck, or formula short. These are things that affect your daily life. It doesn't affect me and yours as much anymore, but it does affect a lot of people, and hopefully this will motivate people to go out there and vote, like you said. Now, we always end up running out of time. I really want to bring up today's important issue. Because tonight, I hope everyone watches the January 6th hearing to see what Congress have found, because there's a lot of discussion, and of course it goes down by party line. So let me be clear on this. If the Democrats did this, if they were in the White House and fight for this, then the outrage will be the same. It should be the same, because no matter who is in power, no matter who you support, this is illegal, and this did happen, and the people need to be held accountable for it, because this country's principles is not based on this. You do not get to dispute an election. You do not get to incite crowds, whether you blame it on the Proud Boys or whatever, these supremacy groups. The fact is, there are government elected officials involved. This is not a witch hunt. This is about transparency. They need to be held accountable, period. What is your take on tonight's hearing?
Well, several things. One is, if they find wrongdoing, then I think it should be brought to light, and the public should make judgments. And if there are crimes that were committed, then people should be prosecuted the same old way. But I think they should be treated fairly. there are a lot of people sitting in jail without any hope of bail, et cetera, et cetera. I think another aspect of the criminal justice system is the incarceration of people who have been accused of crimes but have not been convicted. A second thing is, I think what we're going to see is a reaction to the Democrats' perspective on what happened. And that's fine if there are troubles that Republicans and followers of Mr. Trump or Mr. Trump himself committed wrongdoing, then I think we should all know. But I think we're only going to see half of the story. There's a whole nother half of the story that hasn't been told. Why was the Capitol Hill law enforcement totally unprepared and totally incapable of handling the situation? There was plenty of intelligence that it was coming. President Trump offered to call out the National Guard. Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer said, no, thank you. Muriel Bowser, who's the mayor of Washington, D.C., said, no, thank you. Why they did that, nobody knows. To my knowledge, that whole set of issues has not been on the agenda of this January 6th committee. I think that is a story that is waiting to be investigated and a story waiting to be told. So I think we should look at this as citizens. I think we should look at this in the whole span of things. And there's a lot more. And I would be for a much broader scope investigation to find out all of this. Because if there was inept security then and there, you can bet that that security has not been strengthened since then. So if something else happened, we're going to make that same mistake by default all over again.
Well, I sure hope the same logic applies to Cruz and Abbott on Uvalde. I sure hope that we can apply the exact same logic and say, hey, we got problems, security.
Sure.
Instead of saying, hey, let's give them more, whatever. This is very frustrating. You know,
sure. We know, look, I know a little bit more about that than the general public does. There was a massive failure.
You have law enforcement in your family. I remember that.
Yes. And that's what I'm talking about.
Enlighten us, please.
Though many of the Uvalde police and the Uvalde school police had been trained in disaster preparedness.
I said that. And they bought very expensive high-tech weapons and bodysuits.
All of the above. And they nevertheless failed. They failed on site in many, many ways. That is coming out. And then it failed going up the chain in various statewide, Texas-wide law enforcement agencies as well, the Texas Rangers and the Texas Department of Public Safety, et cetera, all the way to Governor Abbott giving erroneous reports and commendations to law enforcement, only to find out a day or two later that his information was all wrong. It was terribly embarrassing. He used the word livid to describe his feelings when all of that came out. And it reminded me of the ERCOT situation during our freeze. Nobody took responsibility for anything while everything failed right out in public. Unfortunately, I think our leadership from top to bottom suffers from either being inept or not caring or both.
Well, you know why? It's because they know they can pander to their voters, to their supporters, and they will still win without any accountability. Let me be very clear. If today it was a Democrat governor or United States congressman in place of Cruz and Abbott, and the freeze happened and the shooting happened, then we will still be the same outrage at that. That we will still ask them to step off and elect somebody new, because somebody needs to come in here and take accountability and be responsible for their actions. Look at our electricity prices this summer. It's not even really summer yet. It already is 70% higher than last year, and this is after freeze. Look, politicians, elected officials will not be held accountable unless we vote them out of office when they make a mistake, period. And enough manipulation.
I mean, we can do all of that. It's not clear to me that by doing that, anything's going to improve. You've got these massive bureaucracies that are accountable to themselves. Maybe they would improve. I guess I'm just discouraged all across the board.
Yeah,
whether it's a federal agency or a state agency or a local agency.
But you've been at all three at highly effective posts where you're the executive, and then you're very successful in the private sector. So I understand you cannot run bureaucracies like a business, because the business, there's profit and you have more ways to time the screw. But why does this? Look, I'll give you an example. The government, the bureaucracy, say in Singapore or Korea or even Taipei, these are highly effective government agencies because they're run like a private business where there is a lot of oversight and input from the people they serve, and they're being held accountable by that. I know Taipei City is really well run. Singapore definitely. Anyways, that's too far from here. But look, Jim, don't be discouraged. There will be a way to get this better. We need you in office. That's all I'm saying. Because every time we talk about this, it becomes we feel helpless. You remember how angry I was 2 weeks ago. And I prefer to not feel helpless anymore, but we got to go out there and vote. And let's see the hearing tonight and see whether what you say will come true, which I doubt.
And maybe the messages that you and I convey every week to our viewership will encourage people who watch to take a more active role in their own political enforcement and hold accountability, their own community activism. I would hope that would be the case.
I sure hope so, because that's the goal, because it is our duty. And very importantly, it's a privilege, not a right, to have a choice. And if you don't exercise this privilege, then it will be taken away and you will no longer have the right to do this. Right. And if you don't fulfill your duty as a citizen. So Jim, thank you very much for spending time with us. Welcome home. I wish I was in California. Speaking of San Fran, my family members, my wife and kids will be going to San Fran next week. And that's how bad it's become. I have to warn them and say, hey, are you sure about this? Because I'm not going. I have to work.
Tell your kids not to shoplift, because now they're going to get caught.
Well, they just recalled them, so they haven't changed it yet. And my kids know better than to do that. Well, if you shoplift, it cannot be over 90. What is it, $90?
No, $900. 900. But
$900. Oh yeah, that's right. It's 900. Oh my! Like I said, CVS, Walgreens have all pulled out of the Bay Area because 900. This is nuts.
You can't tolerate it. So
I can't. If I was a business owner, I wouldn't be in business. But take care. Thank you very much. Okay. Next week.
Check in again next week. Thank you.
谢谢收看观众们，拜拜。Thank you.
Right.